Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Gideon Levy. He is a journalist for Haaretz magazine, for newspaper in Israel. He is one of Israel's leading dissident journalists and critics of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. He is also the author of the new book, The Killing of Gaza, reports on a catastrophe, available from Verso Press. Gideon Levy, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with the situation of Gaza before October 7th, because your book collects a number of your reports about Gaza, things you have written going back a decade. And in fact, the first half of the book is set before the October 7th attacks and the resulting war. Part 2 is about the war, but part 1 is reports that go back as far as 2014. So because a lot of the memory of the pre-October 7th situation has been sort of erased in the aftermath, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about what the situation in Gaza was like in the years leading up to October 7th. You reported from Gaza yourself for many years. So tell us a little bit more about that context.
Gaza went through many phases, and I chose to start the story of the killing of Gaza much before the 7th of October, because like anything else, the attack on the 7th of October had a context, had a background. By saying this, it doesn't mean that you justify or you don't justify it, but there is a context. And the context is that if you look at Gaza, you have to start with 48, because Gaza is the biggest center of refugees, Palestinian refugees from 48, who live in the most miserable conditions ever since then in refugee camps. And then came 2006, 18 years ago, when Israel made Gaza the biggest cage in the world, the biggest open prison in the world, namely withdrawing from Gaza and making it a prison, a cage. And Gaza is under siege for the last 18 years. This is the context. It's the most abnormal reality that you can imagine yourself. 2.3 million people just closed in a cage. And you wonder what will come out of this experiment in human beings. And here you got it on the 7th of October.
Now, I want to ask you a little more about what you just talked about was the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Now, the story that I assume would be told if I spoke to and I have spoken to defenders of Israel's policy, is you've portrayed that there as Israel turning Gaza into a large prison. You've even used the term concentration camp, which has been used by others as well. The other story that is told is, well, Israel benevolently declined to continue occupying Gaza, let its people be free to govern themselves, and they, I think the line that is usually used is they could have built Dubai on the Mediterranean, and they chose not to. Instead, they chose to continue attacking Israel because they wished to destroy Israel, and Israel had no choice but to respond with the kind of restrictions for the sake of its own national security that were necessary to impose. Now, how do you respond to that narrative of events?
I wish this was the truth. I really wish so, because then we would have been in a different place today. The matter of fact is that Israel, and namely Prime Minister then Ariel Sharon, came to the conclusion that it is too much for the Israeli army both to occupy the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, while staying inside the Gaza Strip, while guarding very few thousand settlers who lived there, who lived in really in an ocean of Palestinians around them, on a stolen land, obviously. And he came to the very clever conclusion that it's for the convenience of Israel to pull out and to change the method of the prison. There are many prisons in the world in which the guards are inside the prison, and there are other prisons in which the guard choose to be outside the prison. Israel changed the method of guarding this prison, but didn't change the prison itself, because from day one, Gaza was under siege. The fact that they chose Hamas in democratic elections does not give Israel the right to put a piece of land under a total siege from the sea, from the air, and obviously territorially. Not that the Palestinians didn't do mistakes, and they could have chosen a different path. I don't say it. But you cannot expect them to behave exactly according to the Israeli expectations, because, they come to this situation who is many years of oppression, of suffer, and you don't change one day and become Dubai.
Now, I think something that perhaps people who have not been to the region might not understand until reading your book, but that comes across very strongly in reading your book, is that Palestinians are one community, which means that when you talk about turning Gaza into a large prison, the movement restrictions between Gaza and the West Bank are an important part of what makes it such a prison, and what makes it such an intolerable deprivation of freedom for people within. You talk a lot about family separation and people's attempts to leave Gaza for medical care, to study, for work. So perhaps you could talk a little bit more about what that confinement and the kind of bisecting of Palestine meant.
That's an excellent point, and thank you for bringing it up. Because people think that the siege over Gaza started only after Israel pulled out. But Israel had this policy of separating the Palestinian people for many years. You rightly say that it's one people, but it is divided mainly by Israel into very small segments which are totally disconnected one from the other. It started in 1948 by expelling 600,000 Palestinians from their lands, from their homes, from Palestine. It continued with the separation between what we call the Israeli Arabs, who are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, and the Palestinians in the West Bank. Then came the occupation of 1967, and we started separating between the Palestinians of Jerusalem and the Palestinians of the West Bank. And then we started to separate between the Palestinians in Gaza and the Palestinians in the West Bank. And it's not only about families to get together or getting medical care, it's about any aspect of life. The West Bank could have been their market. The West Bank could have been their prospects for the future, universities, jobs. The minimum that we could let them was to connect with their families and their people who live 1 hour away. This must be clear. Between the West Bank and Gaza, it's 1 hour drive by car. And we prevented much before Hamas came to power, much before. And therefore, this policy of separating Gaza started much before 2006.
Now, you write, and people may be surprised by what you write here. This is a piece you wrote in 2016, on page 45 of your book, and you're discussing the resistance, and you say that people in Gaza have no choice but to fight for their freedom with their bodies, their property, their weapons, and their blood. You say there's no way open to them except for violence or surrender. They have no way of breaching the fences that pen them in without using force, and their force is primitive and pathetic, almost touching. A people that is fighting for its freedom with kites, tunnels, mirrors, tires, scissors, incendiary devices, mortar shells, and Qassam pipes against one of the most sophisticated war machines in the world is a people without hope. You call them pathetic weapons. So you're talking there about attacks on Israel coming from Gaza, which are portrayed within Israel as an act of aggression. But you ask us to consider the fact that you say that there wasn't really if we concede that the conditions were intolerable and that they were in the right to resist the conditions, that they had very few means available to them to resist those conditions other than the use of the rockets that they had and these burning kites and such.
Look, first of all, when I wrote this, I wasn't aware that they had this very sophisticated system of tunnels, which they started to build then. It wasn't there yet, but it didn't change the picture. Yes, they have, I mean, if you compare the Israeli army, which possesses any possible weapon in the world, but really any possible weapon in the world, and you compare it to them, so sure, they had very, very primitive equipment even today. We are all shocked by their rockets, but those are the most primitive rockets that anyone can imagine himself. And in the same time, what other options did we leave them? Did we really ever treat them as equal human beings? Did we ever recognize their equal rights like the Jews in this piece of land? Did we ever, were we ready to enable them to have a state equal to Israel? And don't tell me about a demilitarized state and Bantustan. No, they have the right to have the same state like Israel, like the Jewish state. And Israel never had an intention to let them have this. So if you push them to the corner, even the international law recognizes violent resistance as legitimate as long as it is aimed against the occupier.
Now, I just want to ask you, you say in the book that every hesitant attempt they make to take a different path, a truce, a change in leadership, or in their political positions, immediately encounters automatic Israeli dismissal and rejection. Israel believes them only when they shoot. You also mention in the book that Israel wanted to avoid a unified Palestinian peace partner. Why? Could you elaborate on that a little bit and also explain why Israel would be interested in backing Palestinians into a corner where the only option available was this kind of violent resistance?
Very simple, because Israel wanted and still wants to maintain the occupation. And Israel wants to maintain the Palestinian people, to keep them under oppression. Israel is not ready to give them any kind of equal rights, neither collectively and not personally, no national rights. And this is, by the way, wall to wall in Israel. It's not only the right wingers, but it's really a wall to wall agreement in Israel. You just saw last week, there was a vote in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament, and 69, 70 members of parliament voted against a possibility of Palestinian state while only 9 voted in favor. This gave you the whole picture. Israel does not and never really wanted, including not in the years of Oslo, but this I know only today. I didn't know it at the time. I had the feeling that at Oslo there was a hope, but I think it was a trap. But in any case, Israel never meant to give them full rights. And in order to maintain it, you have to oppress them by force and to cut, to kill any partner, any chance. I mean, look, I'll give you one example, Marwan Barghouti. Marwan Barghouti was the most hopeful leader for the Palestinian people after Yasser Arafat. He's in jail and he will stay in jail for many, many more years. He was convicted for all kinds of terror actions, like many freedom fighters in the world. Nelson Mandela was convicted for terror and many others. Israel will never release him. And you know why Israel will never release him? Because he symbolized a chance of someone that could be a partner and could unify the Palestinian people and could go for agreement. But Israel doesn't want it.
Now, let me ask this though: those who voted against a Palestinian state, presumably also do not want Palestinians to have equal rights within the state of Israel. They don't want to give them full equal democratic rights. If I talk to them and ask them what is their vision for how this plays out in 20, 30 years, is you maintain control over all of the Palestinians, but they never have equal rights within a state, either a state of their own or within Israel? Do they believe that that's not going to consign Israel to endless violent clashes and resistance?
This was my point for many, many years. I always say, challenge the Israelis. Okay, you are right, everything is right. What will be here in 20, 30, 40, 50 years? And you would never get an answer. But the answer is that most of the Israelis believe that there is no other choice but to keep on with the policy of apartheid, because otherwise Israel will commit suicide. That's the dominant way of thinking. We are in life in existential threat, existential danger, and we have no other choice but to live on our sword. This is obviously, on the 7th of October, you saw that Israel cannot live only on its sword forever, because what happened after the 7th of October showed us that with all the weapons and technology and intelligence, they could penetrate Israel on motorcycles. But Israelis don't draw the conclusions out of it. You rightly phrased it. It's either a free state for them or a democracy between the river and the sea. I think that the free state is not relevant anymore because of the settlements. But in any case, you have to suggest something. And Israelis are not able to suggest it because they are brainwashed that the Palestinians were born to kill them.
Well, I noticed that in the book, when you talked about the building of the security fence around Gaza, you argue that ultimately the fence will be breached. I think you say that in the book years before it happened. And October 7th, from the perspective of from your perspective and from those who read your work, would see it as, well, confirmation of the fact that you can't maintain the occupation, you can't maintain the apartheid, because there's going to be this kind of resistance, even, as you say, with the most advanced military in the world. But of course, for the Israelis that you've been talking about, they interpret it entirely the opposite way, as proof that they are under an existential threat, and that this is precisely why we were right not to entertain a two-state solution, because now we are confirmed in our view that Palestinians just have just desire to
kill and destroy Israelis. So unfortunately, what seems to be proof of the thesis that you're advancing here, for someone who begins with the entirely different worldview, is proof that their worldview is true.
So first of all, let me tell you, it's not only about the Israelis, and it's not only about their security. It's also about the security of the Palestinians. And if there is a people who is under existential threat, it's definitely the Palestinians, much more than the Israelis. The Palestinians might face a genocide, we saw it now, might face a transfer. Their future in this place is much more under risk than the Israelis. And secondly, it's not also the legal or the moral right of Israel, even if Israelis feel under threat. With all the respects, there is international law and international institutions, and Israel, like any other country in the world, must follow them. And if it doesn't, it must face sanctions, because that's the way it goes in most of the cases. So before we handle if it is a risk or not a risk, I think that the whole question is irrelevant, because Israel is not the only actor here. And the risks of Israel are not the only risk, and the suffer of Israelis is not the only suffer. Mainly, it is the smaller suffer. And then I think that after the 7th, I'm much more convinced than before that living only on our sword will lead us from one catastrophe to the other. We never tried the alternative way. We never seriously tried it. And we have to do it because there is no other choice.
You wrote in 2017, when you said that breaches in the wall will be found, you said the only way to deal with the threat from Gaza is to give Gaza its freedom. And now, in looking at what's happened since October 7th, you also argue that Israel's policy towards Gaza, Israel's war on Gaza, does not advance Israel's national security. It further undermines Israel's national security, because in the rubble, in the ashes, among the survivors, I mean, you point out that given the just hideous, gruesome violence in Gaza, those who witness it, those who survive it, you ask, how will they ever forget this? How will they ever forgive this? The next generation of those who will bear immense, rather justified, ill will towards Israel is being created in Gaza right now.
Yes, that's, I think, a very precise description. And it's very unfortunate, but we learned it from history. The first hatred toward Israel started in the Nakba, or even before the Nakba, when Jews came here and tried to kick away the Palestinian. From its first day, Zionism never looked for living together with the Palestinians, with the people who lived here much before us. From day one, you see that the whole strategy is really conquering them in all kinds of ways. It started, for example, in the 20s, in the early 20s, they spoke about conquering the labor, Jews replacing Palestinians in their jobs. It was one of the major values in Zionism. What is this? How do you expect them to react when they see a people who didn't live here for 2,000 years is coming and first of all taking their jobs and then taking their lands? What do you expect them to do? The only way to change this is really to reset the whole values and beliefs of Israelis. We have to, otherwise we are doomed to become, we might be able to continue with the apartheid forever. Look at the United States. The Native Americans lost it forever. Palestinians might meet the same fate. I'm not sure that they will succeed, because Israel is by far too strong. And as long as the West is supporting Israel so strongly, and so blindly, if I may say so, there is a chance that this can continue for many years with, every few years, a small war. Israelis got used to it, but I don't see it. It cannot be viable for a long time. I don't see how it's possible. I don't see.
Now, you are Israeli yourself. You speak to, obviously, a lot of people in your country every week, probably, who disagree very strongly with you, because one of the points that that comes up repeatedly in the book is that there is very little internal, at least among Jewish Israelis, very little opposition to the extreme violence against Gaza. You point out that after October 7th, Israelis were almost unanimous in wholehearted support for the war, that there has been very little or no refusal to serve in the IDF. You have a piece on that, and you argue that as there's a lot of dissenting criticism of Netanyahu in particular, but not of the level of the response against Gaza. Now, I want to ask you, not to psychoanalyze necessarily, but based on your extensive conversations with your fellow Israelis, why do you think it is that there are so few people, even on the Israeli left, who recognize and are willing to say that basic, simple point that you have made several times here, which is that the occupation, the apartheid, are ultimately what creates a threat to Israel's security?
Unfortunately, Israelis live under an umbrella of denial and brainwash, but systematic and very, very deep. We cannot get into all the sources of it, but the main agent is obviously the media, the Israeli media, but not only, also education system and other agencies. But Israelis live both in denial and brainwash. Most of the Israelis have never met a Palestinian, never talked to a Palestinian, except of maybe in good times when it was the street cleaner or the worker who would build their home, but they never sat and met a real Palestinian equal to them. Most of the Israelis have never been to the occupied territories, you'll be surprised. And they live under this myth that all of them are terrorists and all of them Hamas. How many Israelis have ever been to Gaza? When I tell them that I love Gaza as a place, I love the human beings of Gaza, I love their sense of humor, I love their beaches, I love their food, they think I'm out of my mind, because for an average Israeli, Gaza is only a laboratory for terror. There's nothing else but this in Gaza, which is such a biased picture. So we are brought up here from childhood with the feeling that all the Palestinians want to kick us to the ocean, that they were born to kill, that we are the chosen people, that we are the only victim in history, that we have the right after the Holocaust to do whatever we want. Many, many values which we get really into our veins for so many years, and it's very, very hard to break them. And it took also me, if I wouldn't start to travel to the occupied territories 35 years ago, I guess I would have shared the same values today. It takes a lot to break it. And I don't think there's one society in the world which lives in such denial, such lack of self-consciousness. When Israelis see a child throwing a stone in Ukraine on a Russian tank, they would salute to him. They would think that's a hero to throw a stone at the occupier. And in the same time, if the same child would throw a stone at an Israeli tank, they will see him as a terrorist who want to kill all Israelis. And this lack of awareness is very hard to break, very, very hard to break. And after the 7th of October, much worse.
It's very disturbing to me. I mean, there are arguments over whether what is happening in Gaza legally constitutes a genocide, but I don't think anyone can argue that genocidal rhetoric and talking points seem to be pretty common and accepted and normalized in Israel. I mean, there's so many statements from government officials, things that are said in Israeli media about, well, we just need to flatten the place and everyone in it, the young people are the future terrorists and all sorts of things. I mean, the creation of an environment where that level of dehumanization is accepted is very disturbing.
Absolutely, I couldn't phrase it better than you. That's the reality. And it all starts from the basic notion that Israelis don't perceive the Palestinians as equal human beings. You see it in so many ways. That's the core of everything. So many examples when you see that nothing touches the Israelis. And this became much worse after the 7th of October. You will tell them, you are right about defining genocide. We leave it to the International Court of Justice. But they hear about the 15,000 children killed, and they justify it. They hear about the, 20,000 women killed, and they justify it. And would it be doubled or tripled or, God forbid, I don't know how much? Nothing will scratch this defense of Israel, protecting themselves from confronting reality and from confronting basic questions like, what are you doing, for God's sake?
Now, the usual defenses are it's pretty common talking points, which is one, Israel has the right to defend itself. Second, and very often heard, is, well, there's a huge difference, and Netanyahu said this to Congress as well. He said those who refuse to make the simple distinction between those who target terrorists and those who target civilians, that when they do it, when Hamas attacked us on October 7th, they killed civilians on purpose. We only ever do it by accident. It's only ever collateral damage, and we make every effort to minimize civilian casualties. Netanyahu said that to Congress as well. No army in the history of the world has ever done more to warn civilians, to protect civilians. When you hear that, how do you respond to that?
I want to cry. I want to scream. I don't know what to say. How dare you? I mean, not you personally, obviously, but how dare you, Israelis, to speak about a moral difference or a moral values of the Israeli army when this is the outcome? How can you say the Israeli army is doing anything possible to prevent it when you know that the majority in this war, there are no questions, the majority of the victims are innocent people? Even Israel admits it. It's not like Hamas claims. So no doubt about it. No doubt about it that no war there were killed 250 journalists. No war there were killed over 500 medical teams. I mean, so many figures which leave all this argument so hollow. Israel is killing, and you saw so many. I don't even know how to start to bring the proofs because there are so many proofs, micro and macro. You see that this campaign in Gaza is a campaign which includes killings, mass killings, without any measures of international law or others. See the outcome. Why should we argue? See the outcome. And the outcome not speaks for itself, screams for itself.
Yeah, maybe you could elaborate on what the outcome has been over the course of this war and the situation of Gaza now, what has been done to it since October 7th, because obviously there are plenty of reports on this, but we're speaking to a US audience, and I have to say that the US media, while probably slightly better than the Israeli media, certainly Netanyahu got fact-checked by CNN and people when he spoke to Congress. They pointed out that a lot of the things he said were just flatly false. But we don't see the kind of close-ups of what has actually happened to Gaza. We don't get a good understanding of what has been done to the place over the course of the war. So perhaps you could remind us.
So first of all, Gaza was destructed. Destruction is everywhere. The majority of houses in Gaza are not standing anymore. I don't want to start with statistics because statistics is a little dry, but 2.3 million people are living in a hell since the 7th or since the 8th of October. They are being moved from one place to the other like a bunch of sheep without any infrastructure. You know, Israel is moving them from here to there without any safe place. There is no place to hide in Gaza. Israel destroyed almost all the hospitals in Gaza. I just saw yesterday a heartbreaking video of soldiers, Israeli soldiers, breaking an MRI. There is only one MRI system in Gaza, in one hospital. And you see soldiers with hammers are just destroying it. An MRI device, yeah, which costs so much, and 2.3 million people had one. Now they don't have none. People are living without any basic conditions. You should see those refugee camps where Israel pushed them back and forth. And by the way, all of them were also bombed. All the safe places were bombed in the last 9 months. Again and again, each time with another excuse. No water, no toilets. I mean, those are conditions that both of us cannot even imagine ourselves. Not to speak about the fear, the trauma. There are thousands of children who lost their legs. What's about them now? How do they survive there? I really don't know. I wish I could see. What about thousands of children who remain totally alone in the world? Who takes care of them? Who cares about their not only medical and physical situation, but also their mental situation? It's a hell in any criteria. And Israel claims that all this is legal and moral. You know, there is a moment in which words are running out.
And of course, as the war drags on, we see new horrors that come from the result of having people live in destroyed cities for months. Like now we're seeing the outbreaks of new diseases. There's reports of polio and hepatitis. What happens, what happens when the garbage isn't picked up for months on end? What happens to people, it was bad enough at the beginning, but with every increasing month, you get these disasters multiplying. The indirect deaths from war. There's a recent report in the Lancet arguing that we don't know how high the indirect deaths from the war are, but they're going to be much higher than the 38,000 people that are confirmed to have been killed directly from violence.
I want to remind you here that like 10 years ago, the UN published a report that in the year 2020, Gaza will not be a place where people can live. This was an official report by the UN. We are now 2024, much after 2020, and after this horrible war, and people are still living there. It's not a livable place. You mentioned the physical diseases and crises, but I must emphasize again, nobody speaks about their mental situation. What will come out from 2.3 million people, whom the majority are children, who are living under these horrible conditions for so many months? You can imagine yourself how mentally wounded, scratched they are forever, for lifetime. They will never recover from this trauma. And still we continue as if this is normal. And that's made me a very important point. We normalized it, at least in Israel, and I'm afraid the world will normalize it as well. Like, by the way, the war in Ukraine is now more and more normalized. Also, the war in Gaza is normalized, and that's the worst thing that can happen to it.
Well, yeah, I mean, as you're pointing out, as I mentioned earlier, the first half of your book is pre-October 7th, and you point out that Gaza was barely a livable place beforehand. There was mass unemployment. People who went to the few colleges that there were couldn't do anything with their degrees. No one could leave. A lot of the water was undrinkable. The medical care was poor. There wasn't electricity for most of the day for a lot of people. Really dire conditions before the entire place was destroyed. And so it really is, you mentioned the limitations of words. I assume it's really hard for you as a journalist whose the only tool you have is words, right? And we are talking about things that really cannot be conveyed to another person through the use of the kind of tool we have available.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I have two major obstacles as a journalist. The first one is obviously that for the last 18 years, Israel does not let me go to Gaza, which is a hell of an obstacle for me. I was very attached to Gaza, and above all, I'm covering the occupation now for 35 years. And in the last half of this time, I couldn't go to Gaza, and I can go only to the West Bank, but that's a different story. And in this war, really, I found that words are running out, that you don't have enough words because, as I said before, and I would like to repeat it, none of us can even imagine himself what does it mean to be now in Gaza. None of us, and none of our listeners can even imagine what does it mean to be a child in Gaza with the bombs, those heavy bombs, day and night, with the destruction, the starvation, the struggle to find one peck of rice. I mean, we have no idea what those people are going through, and nothing is normal about it, as nothing is acceptable about it.
Now, I want to conclude here by talking about the United States, because as I mentioned, we are speaking to an American audience. The week that we're recording this, Netanyahu did come and address Congress, where he received a record number of standing ovations by the United States Congress. A number of Democrats boycotted his appearance, but about half of them attended, and many of them were extremely supportive, as he told a series of what I've pointed out were lies. But if you were to speak directly to the American people, we know that that a lot of what Israel does, it is able to do because the United States funds and arms it. There has been no ceasefire agreement reached, and perhaps it is the case that if the United States changed its policy, such an agreement could be reached, something could be done. What do you think the United States government ought to be doing right now, and what would you like to see the people of the United States, there's been a massive protest movement, pressure its government to do?
I could speak about it for hours, and I obviously will not, because I think that's a major, or maybe the most important point. First of all, about the Netanyahu's speech in the Congress, I think it was the most shameful session of the American Congress ever. What did they cheer for? And whom did they cheer for? Someone that very soon might face an international arrest order. Someone who is suspected in crimes of war. Who and why did you cheer him? I mean, you want to invite him, that's fine. But how can you look at the eyes of the legislators in the Congress and the Senate with those 55 standing ovation, not mentioning even once the victims of Gaza? Nothing. Neither Netanyahu, by the way, also not the speaker. The speaker the Speaker of the House spoke only about the 7th of October, as usual. So first of all, this was really a shameful moment for America. Now, it must be clear, if the United States would have wanted this war to be over, it could have been over within days. And with all due respect to President Biden, whose intentions I'm sure are genuine and good, I give him the credit. I give him the credit. But you cannot advise Israel or threat Israel and not do anything about it. You wanted Israel not to enter Rafah, and you even threatened Israel not to enter Rafah, and Israel entered Rafah, spitted at you, and you didn't take any measures. So what is the lesson for Israel? That it can do whatever it wants. So this war is an American-Israeli war against the refugees of Gaza. It's not only an Israeli attack, it's an Israeli-American attack. And this is the way it will be remembered. And all this hypocritic expression, we ask Israel to be more careful with killing civilians. Israel doesn't understand this language. If you want Israel to stop the massacre, do something about it. And the last advice, both to the government and to the civil society, remember how you treated South Africa. This was the first apartheid state. You knew very well how to deal with South Africa until the apartheid system fell, and it had been falling mainly because of the international community. Same way you should treat the second apartheid state, namely Israel.
Well, obviously, there's so much that we don't have time to get into, but for our readers who want more on the background to this war, the situation before October 7th, October 7th itself, and the catastrophe that has unfolded since, they should pick up Gideon Levy's The Killing of Gaza Reports on a Catastrophe, which compiles his journalism over the course of the past decade, available from Verso Books. Gideon Levy, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a very interesting and challenging conversation, I think.
Right.